What would you do if the only thing standing between you and the street was a broken-down kiln and a dead woman's apron? What if everything you knew how to do, everything that made you, you, was the one thing the whole town had already decided was worthless? Pull up a chair and settle in close tonight. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from as we tell you the story of Cecily Ames and the forgotten pottery on Harrow Creek. Cecily Ames came into the town of Dunmore with soot still under her fingernails and a canvas sack slung over one shoulder. The sack held three things: a change of clothes, a tin of dried beans, and a potter's rib, a small, curved tool carved from cherrywood, its surface worn smooth by years of use. It had belonged to her teacher, Ida Sutton, who had died the previous winter. It was the only thing Cecily had asked for when the Sutton family had cleaned out the workshop and sold the wheel and the kilns to a man in the next county who planned to use the building for grain storage. Cecily had held the little tool in her palm while everything else was carried away. It fit perfectly in her hand. It still smelled faintly of clay. She was 22 years old. She had no family she could name, no savings, and no letter of introduction. What she had was 7 years of learning from Ida Sutton. How to read the moisture in clay by the way it pulled against the heel of your hand, how to coax a thin wall up from the wheel without it collapsing, how to fire a piece slowly enough that it didn't crack in the heat. Ida had called her a natural. The rest of Dunmore, it turned out, called her something else. She found the town the way a person finds anything they aren't looking for, by following the road until it ended somewhere. She'd heard there was a shop on the main street that sold dry goods and sometimes took on help. She heard wrong. The man behind the counter, a heavy-set fellow named Mr. Corbin, whose thumbs were perpetually tucked in his suspenders, looked her over with the patient disinterest of someone evaluating livestock. "Potter, you say?" He said it the way you'd say ice sculptor or cloud painter. "We've got a hardware man, a seamstress, 2 milliners, and a cooper. We do not have call for a potter." She asked about boarding. He sent her to Mrs. Fitch's house at the edge of town, a clapboard building with a sagging porch where 3 other women already shared 2 rooms. Mrs. Fitch was not unkind, but she was practical. She charged $2 a week, and she expected it on Sunday mornings without discussion. Cecily had $4 and change. She had, in other words, 2 weeks. She spent the first 3 days of those 2 weeks walking up and down the main street of Dunmore, asking at every door: the bakery, the laundry, the feed store, the schoolhouse. She was polite and she was honest, and she got nowhere. People weren't rude to her exactly. They were something worse. They were sorry. The dressmaker pressed her lips together and said there simply wasn't room. The schoolteacher looked at her hands, at the faint, indelible stain of clay in the creases, and said she wasn't sure the parents would take to it. On the 4th day, she walked out to the creek. She needed to think, and she needed to be somewhere that didn't smell like other people's cooking. Harrow Creek ran along the northern edge of the town's claim, past a stand of cottonwoods and a low limestone bluff. It was the kind of place people went to in summer but mostly forgot about in November, which is what it was now, gray and cold and sharp-aired. She sat on a rock at the water's edge and held Ida's tool both hands and tried very hard not to cry. She didn't cry. Instead, she looked upstream. Half hidden behind the cottonwoods, half collapsed into itself, was a building she hadn't noticed before. It was set back from the creek on a slight rise, built of pale limestone blocks that matched the bluff, which was probably why she'd missed it. The roof on one end had caved in entirely. The other end still stood, its single chimney listing badly to the left. Around it, the ground was littered with broken shards, curved fragments of fired clay, in dull reds and creams, half buried in the mud and leaf litter. They crunched softly under her boots as she walked toward it. Someone had made pottery here once. The door, what was left of it, hung on one hinge. Inside, the smell hit her first. Clay. Not fresh clay, not living clay, but the ghost of it, layered in the walls and the earthen floor over years and years. Her chest did something complicated. It felt like grief and like recognition at the same time. The kiln was still there. It was built into the back wall, stone and brick, the arched firebox door, still intact, though the interior was choked with fallen debris and what looked like an entire bird's nest. The wheel was gone. There was a square depression in the floor where it had sat. The wood rotted away decades ago. But the kiln was a solid thing, built by someone who knew what they were doing. The arch hadn't collapsed. The flue was damaged but present. She stood there for a long time in the cold and the quiet, looking at it. An old man was leaning on a fence post at the edge of the cottonwoods when she came back out. He had the look of someone who had lived in one place so long he'd started to resemble it. Weathered, unhurried, the color of old timber. He introduced himself as August Crane. He ran the livery a quarter-mile back toward town and had, it seemed, been watching her with the mild curiosity of a man who had very little else going on. Poking around the old Marsh place, he said. It was not a question. Who was Marsh? She asked. Potter, dead 30 years. He said it without particular weight. His son moved to St. Louis and couldn't be bothered. Place has sat ever since. County holds the deed for back taxes. He looked at the building the way you look at something you've looked at so many times it stopped being anything. Nobody's wanted it. How much? She said. Does nobody want it for? He told her. $40. She had $4.11. She walked back to Mrs. Fitch's and sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the room she shared with a woman named Loretta, who worked at the laundry and snored. She laid Ida's tool on the quilt in front of her and looked at it. She thought about Ida, who had started her own workshop at 24 with borrowed tools and a rented space, and who had, by the time Cecily knew her, produced work that sold as far away as Chicago. She thought about what Ida used to say when a piece cracked in the kiln. You don't throw it out. You figure out why it cracked, and then you don't do that again. In the morning, she went to the county land office. The clerk there, a young man with an officious manner and an ink smear on his chin, walked her through the figures with the air of someone explaining something to a child. $40 in back taxes. He could offer a payment arrangement, but only if she could demonstrate a plan for the property. We're not in the business of holding deeds for people who intend to let things sit, he said. I intend to fire the kiln, she said. He looked at her the way Mr. Corbin had looked at her. Ma'am, he said carefully, there's no market for pottery in Dunmore. There's no pottery in Dunmore, she said. That's not the same thing. She talked him into a conditional arrangement, $10 now, the balance within 6 months, provided she was actively working the property. $10. She had 4. She went to August Crane at the livery and asked if there was any work she could do for pay, and he looked at her for a long moment and said he supposed the stalls needed mucking. She mucked stalls for 6 days. She also cleaned tack and hauled water, and did whatever August Crane pointed at without complaint. He paid her fairly. He didn't say much. On the last day, when she handed back the pitchfork and he counted out her wages, he added $1 extra without comment. She didn't ask why. She thought maybe he just recognized a person who was not going to quit. She paid the $10. She had the deed in her coat pocket before the ink was dry. The news traveled the way news does in a small town, not like fire, but like water finding cracks. By the time Cecily walked back down Main Street, Mr. Corbin was standing outside his shop with his thumbs in his suspenders, watching her with an expression she could only describe as personally offended. 2 women she didn't know had stopped their conversation to observe her passing with the attentive silence of birds on a wire. A man she later learned was called Doyle Whitmore, who owned most of the farmland east of the creek and seemed to feel this entitled him to opinions on every other matter in the county, called out from across the street. He was mounted on a gray horse and wearing the self-satisfied look of a man who had never been wrong about anything, or at least had never been told so. I hear you've taken on the Marsh ruin, he said, not quietly. Cecily stopped walking and looked at him. I offered the county $15 for that lot last year, he said. For the limestone. You've paid more than twice that for a collapsed building and a pile of broken crockery. He let that sit a moment. What exactly do you intend to do with it? Make things, she said. He found this very amusing. Make things, he repeated, as if she'd said breathe air or watch clouds. You plan to sell mud cups to a farming town. His horse shifted under him, as if even it found the conversation tiresome. When you've come to your senses, I'll give you 20 for the deed. Take your profit and find something practical to do. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned and kept walking. She heard him say something else, something about widows and wanderers, but she didn't catch the whole of it and decided she was fine with that. What she did catch, as she rounded the corner by the churchyard, was an old woman sweeping the path in front of the small white church. She was thin and precise in her movements, her gray hair pinned back under a dark bonnet. She looked up as Cecily passed and said, without preamble, Marsh knew the creek. Cecily stopped. I'm sorry? That's why he built there. The woman, who Cecily would learn later, was called Ruth Beaumont and had lived in Dunmore her entire 80-odd years, gestured toward the north end of town with her broom as if the creek were standing right there. The clay, in the bend just upstream. He used to pull it straight out of the bank. She met Cecily's eyes. Most people thought he was peculiar. He just knew where to look. Then she went back to sweeping. Cecily stood on the path a moment longer, the cold wind pushing at her coat. Then she went to look at the bend in the creek. The building was hers, but what it would cost her to make it useful was another matter entirely. The first weeks were the kind of work that doesn't show. She hauled debris out of the kiln chamber by the armload, chunks of fallen brick, a collapsed section of flue lining, years of ash and animal matter. Her hands blistered and healed and blistered again. She slept at Mrs. Fitch's, still because the building had no floor that was safe to sleep on, and she walked the quarter-mile to the creek each morning before full light and walked back at dusk. August Crane gave her the use of a barrow without asking why. She thought he probably knew. She rebuilt the flue using techniques she'd learned, watching Ida repair her kiln the summer of Cecily's second year. Slow, methodical work, relaying each brick and packing the joints with a mixture of clay and sand. The arch of the firebox chamber was sound as she'd hoped. Whoever had built it originally had understood heat distribution. She followed their geometry rather than second-guessing it. The floor she cleared down to the earth and relaid with flat creek stones, leveled as carefully as she could manage, with a long straight board and a great deal of patience. And then she went to the bend in the creek. Ruth Beaumont had not been wrong. The bank on the inside of the bend was a deep blue-gray clay that came away from the wall in clean, heavy slabs. Cecily dug a sample and worked it between her fingers. It was fine-grained and plastic, with a quality she recognized immediately. The kind of clay that moves willingly on the wheel, that holds its shape without fighting you. She sat back on her heels in the cold mud and felt something in her chest unknot for the first time since Ida had died. She had material. She had a kiln. She had no wheel. She had, it turned out, August Crane, who had more in his barn than livery equipment. He'd done some rough carpentry over the years and had accumulated a collection of hardware that he kept in a state he called organized and that anyone else would have called chaotic. She described what she needed. He found, over the course of 2 afternoons, enough of the right components that she was able to build a simple kickwheel from his lumber and her own iron wheel head, which she'd carried in her bag from Ida's workshop because she hadn't been able to leave it behind and hadn't known why until now. She set the wheel up in the building, in the corner with the best light from the single remaining window. She wedged her first batch of creek clay on the floor and sat down at the wheel and put her foot to the kick bar. The clay centered on the first try. She didn't make anything that day. She just centered it, felt it spin under her hands, and then let it stop. She sat there in the quiet of the old building and looked at the smooth, revolving form of the clay and thought about Ida, who had told her once that the hardest part of learning to throw was learning to trust your hands. Your head will lie to you, Ida had said. Your hands know the truth. She trusted her hands. By February, she had fired her first load. The pieces were simple. Bowls, plates, a few handled mugs, a set of small lidded crocks that she thought might appeal to anyone who put up preserves. She glazed them with materials she could source locally, iron-rich slips from the creek mud itself, a clear lead glaze over the top that fired to a warm honey color. They came out of the kiln better than she'd hoped, not because she was showing off, but because the clay was exceptional, and she knew it now. She loaded a crate and carried it up the main street to Mr. Corbin's store and set it on his counter. He looked at the pieces the way he'd looked at her, with patient skepticism. He picked up a bowl and turned it in his hands. He looked at the bottom where she'd stamped her mark, a simple C inside a circle. He set it back down. I'll take them on consignment, he said. 30%. 20, she said. And I want them displayed on the counter, not in the back. He thought about it. 25, he said. She agreed. The bowls sold in 9 days. She didn't let herself celebrate exactly. She went back to the creek and dug more clay. She widened the channel from the spring she'd located at the back of the property, so it fed a small settling basin she'd dug for cleaning the raw clay. She repaired the back wall of the building properly, with mortar this time, filling the gaps that let the wind through. But news of what had sold, and for what price, moved through Dunmore the way news does in a small town. People started to appear at the creek building, first out of curiosity, then with actual requests. The woman who ran the boarding house, 2 streets over, wanted a set of pitchers, specific height, with a handle that cleared the shelf on her sideboard. A farmer's wife came in with her daughter and spent a long time looking at a vase. Cecily had made almost as an afterthought from leftover clay at the end of a session. A simple thing, ridged at the shoulder, glazed in deep blue-green from a copper and wood ash mixture she'd been experimenting with. The woman came back the next day and bought it. She came back the week after with her neighbor. The copper-blue glaze was the thing that did it, Cecily thought. It was unlike anything you could get from a catalog. It was the color of the creek in winter, when the light hit it in the afternoon, and it came entirely from materials that were already in the ground here. Copper from old deposits in the clay bank, ash from the wood she was burning in the kiln. It was local, in the way that mattered. She didn't have a name for that yet. She just knew it looked like Dunmore looked when Dunmore was at its best. March came in hard. 3 days of freezing rain followed by a late snow that weighted the cottonwoods and turned the creek road to a glistening mirror. Cecily was up at the building, bundled in her heaviest coat, stoking the kiln for a long firing, when she heard a commotion down toward the bridge. She came out to find a wagon had gone sideways off the creek road. One wheel in the ditch, the other half off the axle, and its driver, an older man trying to free his horse from the traces, was in trouble. The horse, panicked on the ice, was fighting the harness in a way that would hurt it if it didn't stop. Cecily went over the fence without thinking and moved to the horse's head, putting her hands on its face and talking to it the way Ida had once talked to her when she'd panicked at a failed firing, low and even and without any urgency at all. The horse stilled. The man's name was Ward Proctor. He was the circuit doctor for the valley, which covered 6 communities and a good deal of wilderness in between. His bag was in the wagon, undamaged miraculously, and he was due in Teller's Hollow by nightfall for a family that had sent for him 3 days ago. His horse had thrown a shoe on the ice, and he'd been trying to make it on a bad road in failing light. Cecily helped him get the wagon out of the ditch. She offered him the use of the kiln shed to get warm, while she went to August Crane's livery and arranged a fresh horse for the last leg of his journey. By the time she came back, he had found her work table and was sitting at it, turning one of her blue-green glazed cups in his hands with the absorbed attention of a man who notices things. "You made this," he said. "Yes, sir." "Where do you get the clay?" she told him. She told him about the creek bank and the settling basin and the copper ash glaze. He listened with the whole of his attention, which she would come to understand was simply how Ward Proctor did things. He was a man who believed that information, properly received, was a form of respect. Then he said something that changed everything. "Do you know what kaolin is?" She knew the word. Ida had used it for fine whiteware. "Pure clay, low in iron. Your clay bank," he said, "has a white seam running under the blue-gray. I noticed it when my wheel was in the ditch, and I was down in the creek bed trying to assess the damage." He set the cup down carefully. "I have seen clay like that before, in North Carolina. They call it Cherokee clay. Potters there use it to make pieces that fire almost translucent." She looked at him. "I don't know if I'm right," he said. "I'm a doctor, not a geologist. But I think your bank might have more in it than you've found yet." He left on August's horse. Cecily stood in the doorway of her building in the cold and looked toward the creek and thought about what it meant to only dig where you could already see. She waited until the next day's thaw, and then she dug deeper. The white seam was there. Fine, smooth, almost silky between her fingers. Not the same material as the blue-gray clay above it, something purer and more refined. She brought samples in and worked them separately. The clay was difficult. It had very little plasticity on its own, and she had to blend it carefully with the creek clay to make it workable on the wheel. But when she fired a small test piece, it came out pale as birchwood and smooth as a river stone. When she held it to the light, the wall was thin enough that she could see the dark shape of her fingers through it. She put it down on the work table and sat in the chair and held Ida's cherrywood rib in both hands for a long time. She had not found a ruin. She had found a source. Spring arrived, and with it, Ward Proctor again, this time not by accident. He brought with him a letter from a woman in Cincinnati who ran a shop that sold fine goods from artisans across the Midwest, and who had, it turned out, heard about the blue-green pottery from Harrow Creek through a chain of ordinary human conversation that had traveled a surprisingly long way. The woman in Cincinnati wanted to place an order, a real order, with a figure attached that made Cecily sit down. Mr. Corbin's consignment arrangement, she told him politely, was going to need renegotiating. He did not argue. He had watched 12 months go by and had seen with his own eyes what happened when Cecily Ames set her mind to a thing. Doyle Whitmore heard about the Cincinnati order from whoever in town heard it first, which is to say he heard about it inside the week. He did not come to her directly. He sent a man with a message asking if she'd be interested in a business arrangement, something about capital investment and shared proceeds. Cecily read the message once and set it on the table. She wrote back 2 sentences. "Thank you for the offer. I have what I need." She didn't say it with any particular triumph. She said it because it was simply true. That summer, Cecily hired a girl of 15 named Pearl Grady, who had sharp eyes and patient hands and learned to wedge clay with an efficiency that impressed Cecily genuinely. She taught Pearl what Ida had taught her, how to read moisture by feel, how to let the clay lead rather than forcing it. Pearl was quick and curious and asked good questions. Cecily answered them the same way Ida had answered hers, which was directly and without condescension. Ward Proctor sent a geologist from the university in the fall. The man spent 2 days at the creek bank with hammers and specimen jars, and went away with the slightly dazed expression of a person who has found a thing they were not expecting to find. He confirmed the kaolin seam, confirmed the unusual mineral composition of the blue-gray clay above it, and left behind a report that used words like significant and regionally unique and likely extensive. The building was full-roofed now, properly glazed against winter, with a second kiln Cecily had built herself in the East End over the summer. August Crane had added a lean-to on the side for wood storage. Mrs. Fitch had eventually offered her a permanent room at reduced rate. But Cecily had declined. She'd turned the old Marsh cottage attached to the back of the building into sleeping quarters. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and it sat above the creek, and in the early morning before the wheel started turning, she could hear the water moving over the stones below. She still had Ida's cherrywood rib. She kept it on the window ledge above the wheel, where she could see it from her seat. It was the first thing the light hit in the morning. On an evening late in November, a year and 2 months after she had walked into Dunmore with $4 and a canvas bag, Ward Proctor came by to deliver a letter from the Cincinnati shop. Another order, larger than the last. He found Cecily sitting outside on the low limestone wall at the creek's edge, looking at the water in the last of the afternoon light. Pearl had gone home for supper. The kiln was cooling from the day's firing. The building behind them, solid, lit, unmistakably a working place, reflected the sky in its new glass windows. "You should be pleased," he said, settling onto the wall beside her. "I am," she said, and she was. But she was also looking at the creek, at the place where the clay bank curved around the bend, and she was thinking, as she often thought now, about Ida, and about the old potter Marsh who had built his kiln from the same limestone as the bluff, and about how a thing can sit waiting in the ground for decades, patient as stone, until someone comes along who knows how to listen for it. "People in town call it the Ames Pottery now," Ward Proctor said. Cecily nodded. She picked up a small stone from the wall and turned it in her fingers. Creek stone, worn smooth, the same pale color as the kaolin clay. "What do you call it?" he asked. She looked at the building, and then at the creek, and then at the stone in her hand. "I call it what it is," she said. Ida's work finishing. She set the stone back on the wall, gently, where it had been. The creek moved on below them in the dark, the way creeks do, over the clay, over the kaolin, over all the hidden things the ground remembers. And the kiln behind them ticked quietly as it cooled, full of beautiful finished things waiting to be found.